born in Calcutta, but what makes one a Bengali? I grew up for 9 years in Calcutta, but my family is from near the Northwest Frontier Province. My grandfather came to Calcutta because he was a zoologist.
Okay.
And he was he built dioramas at the Indian Museum on Chaurangi, which was then the Imperial Museum. And then after independence, he became the director of fisheries for the government of India. He was trying to promote deep sea fishing. But his real passion was he's well known now as a translator from Chagatai Turkish, Farsi, and Arabic into English for the Asiatic Society of Bengal. So he translated Humayun, he translated a lot of stuff that medieval scholars now can read in English.
Oh my God. Last night, because I was doing my own research as well. I follow you in Twitter, I follow you in Facebook as well. I think you posted something about your parents when they went to Japan.
Yes.
And then you were talking about your dad, how he, inspired you, lots of things. But you were giving your idea about your dad. I mean, he's not a Marxist or that kind of thing.
No.
Kind of like bureaucrat,
My dad was a man of the right, in a way.
Okay.
A third world person of the right, meaning he believed in Indian nationalism and he wanted India to be strong. And he wanted landlords to be disappeared. And, for the country to advance and starvation to end, that form of, he was not a left-wing guy, but he believed that you get there by, similar to the left, get rid of landlordism, but then you build industry. So he was fascinated with the Japanese all his life. He didn't care. He understood India couldn't follow the West. He used to work for the government of India then, for the coal board. And they actually went to Japan in 1952.
I think 52. Yeah.
Yeah. To basically sell coal. It's a pretty interesting story. Yeah. To sell Indian coal. And India was one of the leading exporters of coal to Japan until Australia came in and took over. Now 65% of Japan's coal comes from Australia.
And do you know who's country who import the maximum coal from Australia out of Europe countries? That's Italy.
Well, I mean, the reliance of Europe on coal is going to increase.
But there's a catch here, the Australia, why they are, exporting coal, because they have got serious subsidies on their coal industry. So they got so much taxpayers' money, they are overproducing, and now they are actually exporting. I mean, this is like fossil
and they're making a lot of money because coal prices have gone up. It's and bloody India, huge coal reserves somehow can barely keep up with the internal demand. And I mean, it screws the environment and all that. So there's that. Anyway, how did you get yourself to Dundee?
Okay, so it's a long story. My family came here in the 1970s. So I was the last man to come here. I was in Australia a couple of years. So basically, last 25 years, I've been in Dundee. I did my PhD in Dundee as well. So then got a job. I met another Marxist guy as my supervisor. So I still remember, that's like Norrie McQueen. I'm not sure whether you know him. I mean, he's like one of those guys, because of him, I kind of ended up in this kind of academia. So when I actually went to his office for the first time when I came here, went to his office, first thing I saw in his office is a huge Lenin's picture in his office.
Wow. Wow, that's something.
And that's it, more or less. I mean, I thought, oh my God, this is the guy I'm actually waiting for.
That's hilarious. How did you get radicalized?
I think there are like 3 revolutionary socialists in Dundee University, and I'm one of them.
You brought this with you to Dundee, right? It wasn't Dundee that brought you this.
So like even like growing up in Bangladesh, so like my father was very secular, you know, like lots of books came in the house, lots of poetry, like Tagore played a big role in our upbringing. Also like 71 war also, you know, because my parents, my mother was a teacher. So she was involved in the, you know, all those things. And my father was actually tortured and by the Pakistani army. He was a banker. He used to work in a bank. He died in 1997.
But why did they pick him up? Because he was part of the movement, or what was the reason?
Yeah. So like both my parents were involved in, do you know this like Awami League? During that time, Awami League. So they're the part of Awami League, you know, local branches. And I was telling this funny story because my father was a quite fearful man as well. You know, like this is the guy who's just a reader, you know, he's a like scholar guy. He lived a very, you know, very introvert life. And then suddenly he was exposed and he was obviously terrified. And one day he was picked up by this Pakistani army and then took him to a gunboat. And then at one point, this bunch of soldiers thought that just like, you know, hit him with a rifle butt. And then he actually fell over from the gunship in the river. And so he lost his consciousness. And then some fishermen picked him up. And the fishermen thought that he's dead, but he was still alive. And that gave him another 30 years to live.
What a man. He was the one who also moved to Dundee.
I mean, my dad came here, but like my mother mostly. So like my mother has been here, my sister's been here, my nephew, nieces, so they are like grown up now. So like Dundee is also connected. The city I was actually from, you know, the Jute. So the Jute.
Of course, I well know. So, I well know the Dundee, Jute Connection. There was a book some years ago written about just this. I remember reading the PhD when it came out about. I can't remember the name of the guy. Wrote a history of Dundee and Bengal. Yeah, of course. You know, I mean, remember I spent my first 9-10 years in Calcutta, and you know, just north of the city are all the jute mills. Of course, in Bangladesh, you had the jute being grown, but all the industry was along the Hooghly. I mean, I don't remember the names but I remember the towns, you know, next to the town of Titagarh, which was the paper factory. Just south of there was all the jute mills. And, you know, it was a huge contest, of course, between the Calcutta Boxwala companies and the Dundee mills, because, you know, they actually competed, but they were two fragments of British capital. Because the jute factories in Calcutta were not Indian companies. Those were basically big British companies. You know, and so it's two fractions of British capital, one located in Scotland, one located in Bengal. Weird, you know, anyway. Anyway, what are we talking about?
The plan is we'll just do a conversation, because my idea is, because I mean, a couple of people are really, you know, big kind of influence in my life. You are one of them. Noam Chomsky, Edward Said, Howard Zinn. And it looks like you were all involved with all these people in your lifetime.
In different ways, yes.
Different ways. And I saw like you were in Beirut with like Edward Said's chair as well.
Yes, that was a chair funded by a progressive Saudi billionaire. Interesting whole thing about that, because he used to be, I think, the main funder of Twitter or investor. And his father was a prominent, liberal in Saudi Arabia, and the mother was the daughter of one of the first Lebanese prime ministers. Anyway, after 9/11, this man Prince Al-Walid bin Talal was very moved by 9/11's aftermath, the kind of anti-Muslim sentiment. So he said, look, instead of setting up institutes to study the Muslim world in the West, we need to set up institutes to study the United States in the Arab world. So he set up the Center for American Studies in Beirut and in Cairo. And in each of them, he had an Edward Said chair.
Okay.
So I was for some time the Edward Said chair in Beirut for this Center for American Studies and Research, which was funded by Prince Al-Walid. And the idea was to teach people in the Arab world the realities of the United States, because they have a kind of illusion of what the US is. And, I wasn't the best person to get into the culture and thing, but I taught about, I taught a class in Marxism, in fact, at the American University in Beirut. And I was told it's the first time a course called Marxism was being taught since the very great Palestinian scholar who wrote the best book on Iraq, Hannah Batatu, used to teach there. And Hannah Batatu's book on Iraq, which is on the old social classes, it's an extraordinary book about Iraqi politics and political parties and even kind of society. Then Batatu wrote a book about Syria, which is hugely instructive about the history and sociology of Syria. And then he was living in Lebanon, teaching at the AUB, and then he left the country and went to the United States to teach in Washington, D.C. And the rumor has been for years that he was writing a book on Palestine. Now, he's buried in Winsted, Connecticut, which is the same town where Ralph Nader lives. So I went to visit Ralph Nader and his sister Claire. And I said, where's Hannah Batatu's grave? I want to pay homage to this great Palestinian Marxist, but also, where's that book? And Ralph got me in touch with, I think, his niece. And I called her and left some messages, but I never heard back. Anyway, imagine if somewhere in Connecticut, in some house, there's sitting this great book on Palestine. Anyway, life is funny, right?
Did you have a chance to meet Edward Said face to face?
Yes, many times. I first met him. I was a graduate student in Chicago at the University of Chicago. And, I think it was in 1990, August, 2nd of August, 1990, that Saddam Hussein sent his armies into Kuwait. Well, there was a big build-up, ratcheted up thing of having a war against Iraq at the time. And, I got involved in the anti-war sort of thing, not for any other reason than I thought it would be disastrous for Iraq. And we brought Edward Said to speak on the campus. At the time, there was a young assistant professor of Middle East studies there, Rashid Khalidi. He and Mona Khalidi and others and a bunch of students, we gathered together. I played a minimal role in this because I was just in my first year in graduate school, but we brought Edward Said. I didn't do anything to bring him there. My job was to make sure that the snacks were there in the snack room and that kind of thing. Edward Said came, and the hall was packed, but there was also a lot of security because at the time there was a lot of threats on his life. From Zionist organizations. And in fact, he gave a good talk about how he was against Saddam, but against the war and that kind of thing. But he was seriously, there was a huge queue of people wanting to attack him on Israel. And afterwards I got to talk to him, and then I saw him several times in New York,
Columbia.
I once visited the home of the Saids, and it's an incredible man, extremely dignified and so on. But I had a problem because by then Edward Said was reacting poorly to the review of his book by Ejaz Ahmed. And that was a problem because I knew Ejaz Ahmed and I didn't want, I was too young and I didn't want to get caught up in between two people that I admired both of them. And so anyway, but yeah, I met him. And then, later I got to know his wife and his daughter very well. And I met them many times when they used to visit Beirut. It was a huge honor for me to have a chair, named after him. A huge honor. Yeah, he was an incredible person. And also, whatever disagreements I had with his work, and I know Ejaz had whatever, you got to give it to the man. I mean, he stood for his principles. He fought to defend the Palestinian cause right till the very end. I mean, he was unmoved by that. Disagreements one would have with him is, I thought he did Marx a great disservice. I thought it was a kind of casual way in which he sort of called Marx an Orientalist. Which, you read the work of Nestor Cohan, who is a Marxist in Argentina. And then later, of course, Kevin Anderson's book. I mean, I have to say, everything in Kevin Anderson's book is already there in Nestor Cohan's work, but Nestor writes in Spanish. So that's a disability as far as the international, networks of scholarship are concerned. But, Marx is, as you know, far more complicated than an Orientalist. I mean, Marx was against the colonization of India. It's wrong to say that Marx celebrated it. No. Yes, in 1853, he wrote some sentences which you could interpret as British colonialism will knock over feudalism, because that was his assumption. But it didn't happen. And then when you read his writings, at least even up in Capital 1867, he's pretty clear that, colonialism is not dealing a death blow to feudalism. But it's true in 1853, and in fact, in the Communist Manifesto 1848, he believes that capitalism is going to destroy feudalism in general. The Chinese walls will be knocked down, he writes in the manifesto, 1848. 53, he says, British colonialism is going to push aside. Those were not rooted in his epistemology. Those were his assumptions, that he assumed these things would happen. Well, when by 1867, he was very clear it didn't happen. So how can you call Marx an Orientalist? I mean, Marx was very much in favor of India defeating Britain in some of his writings on the Great Uprising of 1857. 4 years after that, one essay, The Results of British Rule in India, 1853. People concentrate on that one piece of journalism, but he wrote a lot about India, including right up till the very end in his ethnological notebooks and so on. And I thought Edward Said's one place where I would quibble with him would be, I think he does a real disservice to Marx. I mean, and I know I'm going on and on with this.
Okay.
Yeah, please go ahead.
No, I'll just interrupt just one thing. He died too early. I I still think that he might get back to those points and then rectify himself. But his life was too much going on with his life. He was in all kind of bad places. And then this Oslo Treaty, I think, destroyed his mindset as well. So he was quite fell out with Yasser Arafat. So health-wise, he was already suffering since 1994, 95. So he was just living dead. But this guy, I think you mentioned about, even with Noam Chomsky, you have got differences. He's an anarchist, you are Marxist. Howard Zinn also, different way. But I think these are good people. These are the good forces for our society. They did their share, to make things a bit better for everyone.
They are sincere people, okay? That's the main thing. Look, frankly, it's a little frustrating these days. And I'm speaking personally, and I'm happy to speak with you about. I mean, you take a position that people don't like, and then instead of arguing on the merits of the position, they'll say you deny genocide, or you do this or you do that. Noam faced this a lot in his life. I mean, including near arrest by the US government and so on. So I feel like we are in a really dangerous period in world history. I know it's perhaps cliched to say that, but the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their recent draft document says we are in a red alert. And a friend of mine who's a scientist read the whole report and said it's even worse than what's in the executive statement. I only read the executive statement. So it's a bad time to be, squabbling and trying to destroy reputations. That's what I admire so much about Chomsky. I just did a book with him, and it's a really interesting book because we chit-chat about a range of things. But at one point, I said to him, something like, you're a really courageous person. And he said, I'm not courageous. And then he went on a thing about Vietnam, which is beautiful. But he said, the reason I'm steadfast is I'm arrogant. I thought that was the cutest line. He said that I don't care what people say about me. And that may be true for him. But what I see in people like that is I see a kind of prophetic instinct. He looks at the world, he studies the world, and then he produces a kind of moral place to stand. And isn't that the job of, quote unquote, the prophet? The prophet, and I don't mean this out of some adherence to the Judeo-Christian Islamic heritage, but I'm just talking about, the idea of being somebody who sees things. Prophecy, not in terms of foretelling, but even being able to talk about the today and maybe the tomorrow. People who cultivate that kind of wisdom become a little bit like a prophet. All prophets don't necessarily get it from God. They get it from study, sensitivity, trying to read things around them, knowing, being wise. To be wise is to read, is to understand history, to understand sociology, culture, all of it, everything. And so, like all these people you mentioned, I find there are elements of, kind of the wise person. Chomsky is certainly super wise, really, really wise man. Zinn was like that as well, but Zinn, nobody's like Chomsky. Chomsky is in his 90s, he's lived a long time. He's absorbed a lot. And he knows everything about every part of the world. He's incredible. He continues to read the newspapers from front to back. Now, in his 90s, he's super aware of what's going on. And, some of the others we've talked about, they were not at that league. I mean, they didn't. They had their own specialities. Zinn understood American politics really well, but the world was not his. He didn't understand the whole world. I mean, I'm not saying Noam understands the whole world, but he understands a lot about the world. And I think similarly, Edward Said, was a super smart guy and sensitive and understood culture very well and so on. But, his grasp of like if I was sitting with Said and I said to him, there was like a strange situation in Pakistan, strange brewing situation in Pakistan, Imran Khan, all that. Neither would Zinn or Edward, but Chomsky would know what to say. He would say yes and blah, 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 blah. And, there's a problem in Pakistan because, it's basically a country defined by the military. And the military didn't want Imran Khan to cross the IMF. And when Imran Khan decided to go to the Russians to get oil, to cut a deal with them, to get out of the kind of oil credits from Saudi Arabia, to lighten the IMF burden, blah, 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 blah. Noam knows all of that stuff. And that's impressive. So, yeah.
I like Noam so much, sometimes because he's getting now to a point, he's like 90 years old. Sometimes I feel that, I will just write to Noam Chomsky and then ask him to come to Scotland, and I'll take care of him for the rest of his life, so that, no one can touch him. I'll just, very tribal way. I mean, it's just, I just cannot imagine that if he dies, what this will do to me and, people like you and, it just, what you would say the right word. I think the prophet is the right word here. You don't need a God to become a prophet. He's the prophet.
Look, firstly, he's not going to travel anywhere because the pandemic has terrified him. He used to go every year to Brazil because his wife is Brazilian, Valeria.
Yeah.
And he would be, he'd go every year, but he's not going to travel anywhere. And he doesn't like to see visitors because he's older, and this disease is tough. It's a tough disease. But he would love to come and talk to you on Zoom.
At this point, our talk was distracted with Noam Chomsky's beard.
On the other hand, he kind of looks good with the beard. He looks like a prophet. A biblical kind of character.
Okay.
And he has a low voice, and especially on Zoom, he looks up at his camera like that with his big beard, and he's got he's got a low voice. He's got a prophetic sensibility. It's quite powerful. It makes me want to cry every time I watch him. Talk like that, because I didn't know him in his youth, but I first met him. He must have been in his 60s, and it's a very different person, obviously. I met him when he was just about a little older than I am now. And that was incredible, because even at that point, he was, effectively iconic. And but also super generous as a person. The most generous of any, let's say, person with that kind of renown that I've ever met. Super generous, just like an ordinary guy. He has no airs. He knows he's Noam Chomsky. He knows that. He knows what it means to be Noam Chomsky. It's not like he's delusional, He knows that he is Noam Chomsky. And that's a burden, To be Noam Chomsky is a burden. It's not something you can just hold lightly. Do you see what I mean? That's a burden, because, people expect him to know things and say things, and you get attacked a lot and so on. He knows he's Noam Chomsky, but it doesn't affect his interactions with people. It's pretty amazing.
My funniest video of Noam Chomsky is, this right-wing guy in America's media, someone called Buckley Jr.
Yes, William F. Buckley. Sure. Yeah.
So when he died, Noam was asked to do a kind of, some kind of obituary of 5 minutes. And Norman started with I'm just not sure why I'm invited to say anything about this guy.
Well, yeah, in that sense, he's a very sincere person.
Very sincere. It's just what good to say about this guy. It showed, these are the people, promoted, pushed forward by the establishment. These people became a scholar or knowledgeable people. Another story I want to say, because I really want to share. Edward Said has got a debate in mid-80s with Israeli ambassador in USA. Just guess, who was that?
I don't. Who was that? Was that Netanyahu?
That was Netanyahu. He's a young guy. So this TV show organized this debate with Netanyahu and Edward Said. Edward says, yeah, I've got no problem. I'm an academic, so I know. So Edward Said took his son to the studio and had the debate. And at one point, the guy who was moderating the session, he was saying that, Edward, so this is the guy you think that you were arch enemy. Will you talk to him? Say hi to him and Edward says, yeah, I've got no problem with this. And then they asked the same thing to Netanyahu. Do you know what he said? The first thing, he gave it like 5 minutes speech about, why he should never talk to a terrorist.
God.
So Edward Said suddenly became a terrorist. He's a symbol of terrorism and everything. And the best part of the story is when Edward Said was coming back home with his son was then like 8 or 9 years old. And his son did not talk to him in the car because he really believed that his dad was a terrorist.
Very moving.
You see, what this
his son is now a very prominent,
famous lawyer. Yeah, he's brilliant.
So,
he's brilliant.
Standing up for those who are wrongfully called terrorists. I suppose the impact of that, I didn't know about that story, but I wonder if, these things do impact people. You think I'm going to defend my father forever now, and you go and become a human rights lawyer. Yeah, interesting.
But you can see like how the knowledge is being built by these, powerful media, powerful people, and so this is actually knowledge. So like during the Iraq War, the American people know about Iraq. Actually, what Washington D.C. knew about Iraq is not about from the Iraqis or the people who are suffering in Iraq or like Baghdad. So the knowledge was coming through Washington D.C., White House, and these people. I think you like mentioned about 1991 when like Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Obviously he's like one of those thugs, but at the same time, what America did, So the first thing they did is they sent James Baker, it's called tin pot diplomacy. So basically he went to Saudi Arabia first and asked Saudi king that, can you give me $20 billion? Because, we need to punish this guy. And the Saudi king said that, okay, I'll give you $20 billion if you match this with Kuwait as well. So Kuwait has to pay 20 billion as well. So that made 40 billion. And then he went to Japan, got another 14 billion from there. And then went to Germany because Germany could not provide any soldiers. So they asked him, can you give me some money? So the whole first Gulf War actually cost 62 billion. And out of 62 billion, 56 billion was actually just like, So this is like kind of like bang money. So for America,
in a way,
this was a money,
but yeah, it's a free war, but it's money. But also it's the way in which the storyline is constructed. One of the things that's completely forgotten right through the story of the first Gulf War is that 3 times Saddam Hussein sent a diplomatic note asking for a negotiation. The first note was stupid because he said, we will pull out of Kuwait if the Israelis pull out of Palestine. That was just not going to happen. So, but that was his first note. The second note, he said, okay, fine, the Israelis don't have to pull out of Palestine, but we need a commitment from them that the Palestinians will not be treated badly. It was a very mild thing that was not published anywhere. Eventually, that note or the existence of it was leaked to a newspaper in Long Island called Newsday and published in Newsday, but not published in the New York Times. And the reason it was eventually known was because the person who carried the note from the Iraqis to the US was Yasser Arafat. And that's why it was known. Arafat played the role of mediator. In fact, it's really interesting that Edward Said turned against Yasser Arafat, not because of the Oslo Accords, the Madrid, negotiations and then Oslo. Not because of that, but because Arafat in 1991 stood with the Iraqis against the US and said, we stand together as Arabs. And the reason Arafat did that wasn't necessarily because Saddam was like his friend or anything, although the Iraqi government did provide a lot of support to the Palestinian cause. That wasn't the reason. The main reason was that I think that the Palestinians had been carrying these notes back and forth, which were effectively notes from the Iraqis saying, okay, we'll retreat, but let us have some dignity. Agree that we have now reached an arrangement. Don't make us retreat with nothing in our hands. And the US refused and then pummeled Iraq in like a vengeance kind of thing. And I think that played a role for Arafat. Like, he was like, what are you? And it's actually instructive. The way the US bombed Iraq and betrayed the southern Iraqis, who they asked to rise up, particularly the Marsh Arabs, and then betrayed them, all of that is revealing. But I know that Edward Said turned against Arafat around then. And then Oslo was the last straw.
Yeah. Because I mean, after the Oslo, he wrote this piece like morning after. It was quite a, serious attack on. And I think, I mean, what Edward Said was saying, that after Oslo, he never talked to Yasser Arafat at all.
His essay he wrote the next day is called A Palestinian Versailles. It was published in the London Review of Books. And it's a pretty hard-hitting piece. But, people, if you go back and you read it, there's actually two things happening there. One is it's an attack on the deal itself, the Oslo Agreement. But secondly, it's an attack on the procedure. There was a public negotiation taking place in Madrid where there was some democratic oversight of what was happening, and then there was a secret negotiation happening in Oslo. And so there was a problem there that eventually the democratic negotiation was a facade. And a lot of people, including Rashid Khalidi, who I mentioned earlier, were working on the Madrid process. And they felt betrayed by the procedure. I mean, so there were 2 points he made. But I think Said also was losing kind of faith in the PLO and Yasser Arafat personally after the Iraq war. Then, to some extent, also from the way in which the PLO and Arafat was handling the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, most national liberation movements were disoriented because whatever support the PLO got from Iraq, they got more from the USSR. And that was a big blow. And look at the consequence of that blow. When the US became, the single master of the world after 91, the US basically told countries like India, if you want to rationalize with the United States, you have to go through Tel Aviv. And so India, for the first time, recognized or normalized relations with Israel in 1992. So, I mean, it was difficult for the Palestinians between 91 and 94 to see what was going on, because all these strong allies of Palestine, like India, began to normalize with Israel. And not just India, but also, quote unquote, Islamic countries, which had previously been pretty strong by and large. Egypt had a peace deal in 79, and but by and large, countries like Indonesia and all that were pretty strong. All of that began to wither after the USSR collapsed. And so, I mean, Arafat's position was difficult. And I feel a lot more needs to be studied about the PLO and Arafat's diplomatic collapse after the collapse of the USSR, and then the surrender. I mean, look, frankly, the surrender of the Palestinians comes at the same point, in the same year, and also the same kind of character as the negotiated settlement in South Africa. South African apartheid ends also in 1994, same year as the Oslo Accords. And it's also a limited freedom because they agree not to touch the economy. They agree not to redistribute land and all that. And so it's a constrained freedom. It's what's known as a negotiated settlement. But it could also be seen to some extent as a very constrained form of freedom. Because
I mean, you are a historian. I mean, I took a bit of different way. I thought that the Yasser Arafat was dragged into this like peace process because he was in a bad situation in like Tunisia, because he was he's gone, and there was a like uprising. The first Intifada started mid-80s. That kind of that made IDF in a kind of bad position, because IDF is good in fighting with tanks and F-16, but they're not good in like fighting with the kids who are throwing stones to the tanks. And all the news coming out about this, so that it's a total like media disaster for like Israel. So I think that's why they try to bring, like revive like Yasser Arafat's position, and then because they thought that PLO is better than this like this like first Intifada, because I thought first Intifada could have actually achieved much bigger thing than what actually Yasser Arafat did. I mean, so from that point of view, I'm quite kind of from like Edward Said's idea that what Yasser Arafat did actually did mistake, but also it's just like what USA did during the time is after the Cold War, is the money is on the table, and then and then Yasser Arafat suddenly, you can see like some of those pictures, like behind the scene pictures in the like White House in the East Room. You can see they're wearing tie, like all those dictators from the Arab world. Suddenly they became friends.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I mean, that the terms shifted with the collapse of the USSR.
Yeah.
That many, even in the Arab countries, they lost a major ally, a diplomatic ally, trade partner, all of that. The emergence of the single master after 91 has to be looked at. I mean, we can't pretend that the world hadn't changed. And I think that people who had cut their political teeth during the height of the Cold War couldn't orient themselves quickly enough, in after 91. And it's not just Arafat. As I said, even the South African leadership, in a way, hastened to the negotiating table when de Klerk said, let's talk. And, South Africa had been weakened by the defeat at the hands of the Cuban army in Kuto Konivale, also 1987, same year as the first Intifada. There's enormous parallels between those two places, because they were two remaining national liberation movements. The difference was that South Africa, the ANC took power in the state, even though it was a constrained, freedom. They were not able to do economic change. In 96, they had to push the gear policy, which was basically liberalization, neoliberal gutting of the state and so on. And then look at Palestine. I mean, whatever rump Palestine was given, these little, Swiss cheese kind of map, the Palestinian Authority ended up becoming like, basically it's a private sector security service for the Israelis.
Yeah. But also like, they thought that, if you start those banking, that kind of industry, people will start, making money, and then they will forget their, struggle. But I mean, that will never happen, So you just cannot have this open jail forever. And also like building all the walls after walls. So like after, 20, 30 years, people will ask Israel that, you are saying you are a democratic country. I mean, why you have got too many walls made? I mean,
right. I mean, what are you afraid of? You're afraid of children and so on. And what does one say? I've traveled to Palestine several times, and it's a miserable circumstance. But on the other side, it's not that much more miserable than the slums of South Asia, which are basically like Gaza and without the bombing. I mean, the difference is that Gaza gets bombed every few weeks. The slums in South Asia don't get formally bombed from the sky. You get police thuggery and so on, or paramilitary thuggery. You don't get bombed from the sky. Small mercies. I mean, you're living in a very congested environment, no future, your children treated like gangsters, and every once in a while there's punctuated communal violence, where everybody gets hurt, the poor get hurt. It's not only Muslims that get targeted, everybody gets hurt. It's a very ugly. And so, I understand that Palestine isn't like a, sui generis by itself situation. There are parallels one way or the other. The difference is that, they don't have any sovereignty and they treat it as they are second-class citizens. You see, in Bangladesh, in the slum areas, people might be treated like second-class citizens, but they're not technically second-class citizens. They could actually fight for their rights.
Yeah.
You could build a political movement of the garment workers, and there are garment worker unions, and there are, politics and so on. It exists. In Palestine, all of that is illegal. And I think that's the, you're not even allowing the people to have formal political rights. That's why it's apartheid. In the slum in Bombay, it might be, near apartheid-like situation. But in Palestine, it's not apartheid-like. It is apartheid. Okay, I have to leave you in a few minutes.
My plan is to, Vijay, since we now know each other a bit, so because I really want to document about you as well, like the way people document Edward Said's life. I think you are.
Please don't even think about it.
You are amazing. You don't know how much love and kindness for you we have.
That's so super kind of you, but I want you to know that I have such low self-respect that I find it even hard to listen to that.
I mean, you are like, you had a dream life. You met all these people, you worked with them. I mean, and then you traveled all over the world. You went to Libya during that, 2011, and you saw like what NATO did in terms of this kind of, no-fly zone bullshit, which is basically, you mentioned that, it's such a no-fly zone. It's actually the opposition party's Air Force they used.
Yeah.
So, I mean, part of me is like, I was planning to do like a couple of parts here. So we'll do like just basic things today. And then my plan is to go for like those more tricky area where you are involved, on the ground. And I think, people like you have got so much things to say about this. Suddenly everyone wants to be the like, NATO members, even like people who are my colleagues in the left politics. Now they are supporting, NATO. So
I can't wait till the government of Bangladesh applies to be member of NATO.
Can like individual also apply for NATO?
Let's try. Let's put in an application and see. It may be the only way to survive in this world is that you join NATO. Okay, I have to go because I have to go. I got something in about 2 minutes.
So
why don't you just write to me and we'll figure something out. Anyway, you send me a note. Let me know what you have in mind, and we'll work something out.
Yeah, bring you even Dundee.
Could be a nice idea.
Yeah,
I haven't. Yeah. I've been to Glasgow, but not Dundee.
Yeah, I mean,
I've been to Edinburgh and Glasgow. I'll come and see the jute mills. So write to me.
Yeah.
Super to be in touch with you. Okay. Take care of yourself.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye, comrade.
Bye.
Je peux vous le rendre, Seigneur, Seigneur, car avec les soldats